Okay, hello everyone, welcome. I'm going to be talking today mostly about one sonnet by Shakespeare, which was included in the handout I prepared, which is there for you on Canvas whenever you want to look at it. So if you have it there on your computers now and you want to keep it open, then that might be useful, but don't worry if you don't, you can look later. It will be projected up on the screen too. So the one of those three that I gave you that I'll discuss today is number 62, and that's the first one, Sin of Self-Love, possesseth all mine ardor. Okay, so what I'm going to do in this lecture today is first of all to tell you a little about the history, we might even say prehistory of the sonnet, and then I'm going to tell you a little about Shakespeare's attitude toward the sonnet, which we might infer from a number of points in some of his plays in which sonnets appear or are mentioned by characters. And then we're going to do some close reading of sonnet number 62 to end up. And we're going to think a little bit about theology, a little bit about sin, and a little bit about narcissism. Okay, so love poems and self-love poems, this is called. So far as we know, the earliest extant that is still existing in manuscript or in print, examples of what we now call sonnets were written by this poet, Giacomo da Lentini. This is a tiny detail from the painting here, which is, as far as we know, the only remaining image that we have of him. He was active in the early 13th century in Sicily, in Palermo in Sicily, what's now Sicily, at the court of the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II. So the sonnet actually goes right back to the medieval period. Da Lentini wrote originally in medieval Sicilian, but his poetry survived in print only in Tuscan. These are regional dialects of, there wasn't then an Italian language in the way that there is now. Here is an example of one of da Lentini's sonnets, which I won't spend time looking at right now, but as you can see, da Lentini already sets, as it were, the kind of standard for how sonnets would later come to be qualified, or how they would be standardized. I think you may have heard this morning about Petrarch's important role in the standardization of the design of the sonnet. But Petrarch was predated by quite some time by this poet da Lentini. Now, when da Lentini and his fellow poets there at the court of Frederick in Sicily started writing sonnets, they did so initially as a kind of competition with each other. So this is going to sound like an improbable comparison, but I think really there's some substance to it. The nearest thing that we have now in contemporary culture to the kind of poetical culture in which the sonnet was first conceived and practiced is something like rap battles. Because poets at this time sought to confront each other, to challenge each other, even to attack and criticise and disrespect each other in poetry. And it was through this combative, contestatory battle of wits between poets that poets first conceived and came up with the idea of these poets, the sonnets, which felt like they were just short enough, punchy enough to be the kind of vessels or missiles that could be used in these contests. So some of these original poems that subsequently would be called sonnets weren't originally called sonnets, they were called tenzoni. And that doesn't mean anything to do with the number 10. It means, roughly, fights, battles. The etymological connection is with our word tensions, in contests, tensions. So tenzoni were the original sonnets, and here is one. Now, one of the ways which we can see in this sonnet that da Lentini sought to distinguish himself from other practitioners of the same kind of style, and to better them, and one of the ways in which he is sort of boasting his skills and his credentials as an original poet, is by the ingenious use of these end words, which, if anyone's at least, you don't need to read this Sicilian dialect or Tuscan dialect, but you can see here that it's the same words repeated at the end, as I've made clearer in this slide. These are technically known as equivocal words, which means that they are the same rhyme words, the very same word each time at the end of the line, but each time with a different meaning. So da Lentini has done something which is very ostentatiously virtuosic, very impressive in writing this sonnet with the same words, and the only English translation that can be made, as you'll see, does not have the same words at the end at all, because in the context of their sentences in da Lentini's poem, the same words mean something different each time. So it is an exercise in verbal ingenuity, a way of showing off how many different meanings can be produced using the same small set of words. So the origins then of the sonnet are in Sicily, among a group of poets competing with each other to show off their verbal ingenuity in their style like this. By the time that the sonnet migrates into England, the earliest known examples of the sonnet that we have in English vernacular, rather than in Latin, were around about the 1530s, and were practiced chiefly by two poets, both great poets of the early 16th century. Sir Thomas Wyatt, up here, writer of some of the greatest early love poems. I urge you all to seek out his love poems, in particular the stunningly beautiful poem, They Flee From Me That Sometime Did Me Seek, which I think has a good claim, potentially, to be the greatest love poem in the English language. So do look for it. They Flee From Me That Sometime Did Me Seek. It's really beautiful and nasty. So Sir Thomas Wyatt and Henry Howard, the Earl of Surrey, were between them the two who kind of introduced the sonnet by imitating Italian models initially. So when the sonnet first showed up in England, it was very much with the kind of Italian label still attached. Sonnets, or as English writers themselves sometimes called them, the sonetto, imitating the Italian phrase, Italian word, were introduced very much as a new innovation that had arrived from overseas, an exotic Italian import into the English language. Here's an example of one of Sir Thomas Wyatt's poems, and again, I won't spend time analysing this. If you want to pause the recording and look again, here is a modernised English spelling of that poem, which might be a little bit easier to read. So read that one and then flick back to that one, because I think it's more delectable, it's a chewier, heartier experience in the kind of dialect language that Wyatt actually wrote in than it is in the modernised spelling version. However, a couple of years ago, almost a kind of serendipitous or chance discovery by a scholar at the University of Oxford, turned up this, which seems, on the face of it at least, to be a sonnet, a much earlier sonnet in English than any by Sir Thomas Wyatt or by Henry Howard, the Earl of Surrey. And this apparently now could be the earliest English sonnet that we know. This is from, as you see, a poet called John Metham, from a longer poem called Amorius and Cleopes from 1448, so a good 90 years or so before the earliest sonnets that we thought had existed. Now, the reason that I am so conditional in the way that I put this, when I say this could be the earliest English sonnet, it predates it by nearly 100 years, then surely it is. Well, no. And this raises an interesting question, the reason why we can't really be decisive in calling this a sonnet. And the reason is because, as I've put here, these are lines 388 to 401 only of a longer narrative poem, the rest of which is not organised with this rhyme structure or in this pattern. So halfway through, as it were, this poem, which is a narrative poem about the story of the love between these two, we have what looks like a set piece, separate poem, a digression, a lyric in the middle, which has the very form of a sonnet, exactly as we would expect, with the octave at the top, the two bunches of four, and then the sestet at the bottom, as you probably learned this morning. But it's in the middle of something else. So the question that this then raises about generic classification, or about how we identify, how we define literature, is a poem with 14 lines and exactly the pattern of rhyming that we expect, organised into octave and sestet, everything that we usually use to identify a sonnet, is a poem that ticks all those boxes and meets that ticks all those boxes and meets all those criteria, a sonnet, when the author didn't know that that's what they were doing. So Metham didn't have that word at his fingertips. He didn't know what a sonnet was, so far as we know at least. He didn't think that he was trying to write a sonnet. He just did it, as it were, by accident. Is that, nonetheless, a sonnet? It's an interesting question. And again, there is a modernised spelling text of that early 15th century poem, which you can pause the recording if you want to have a look at it. And credit where it's due, this translation is by Daniel Sawyer, and he is the medieval scholar at Oxford who discovered this passage and who makes this claim that perhaps this is indeed a sonnet. And if you want to read him argue this, then it's in that article there, Form, Time, and the First English Sonnet in the Chaucer Review from a couple of years ago. Again, this will be on the recording if you want to have a look at it. Now, it's important to note that although the most influential model of the sonnet in English was unquestionably Petrarch, and although the earliest practitioners of the sonnet in the English language, Wyatt and Surrey, did generally tend to write sonnets which are 14 lines, organised into rhyme schemes like that, it was actually still a while before the sonnet ended up being strictly defined as a 14-line poem with rhymes. And again, I don't know whether you've heard this, something about this in the lecture this morning, which I couldn't be at, so forgive me if you've already heard something about this, but here are examples from a text contemporary still with Shakespeare. So this is now a long time after those first English sonnets by Wyatt and Surrey, where, as you can see, these poems, all alike, given the title sonnet. These are all sonnets, and there are many more of them incidentally. This is just the first 3 pages of this set of sonnets. All of these have quite different forms. They're all different lengths. Not all of them are in a decasyllabic metre. In other words, a metre with a line which has 10 syllables. Not all of them are pentameter. Not all of them have the kinds of rhyme schemes which we would expect from a sonnet. You can see number 4 there. I will become a hermit now. Right? Here is a poem in tetrameter, much longer than 14 lines. That, nonetheless, is a sonnet. So there was a period then, in the first kind of flourishing, the first efflorescence of sonnet writing in the English language, around about the time, contemporary with Shakespeare, when Shakespeare wrote his famous sonnets, when poets were still felt that they were at liberty to explore what could be done with this kind of poem, within this form, the sonnet. Because all it meant to them was a little song. A sonnet is a little song. So why not make it a little longer? Why not make it a little shorter? Depending entirely on the content of the poem. Do I want to say something that requires a more expansive kind of lyric, or do I want to say something pithier and shorter? So the sonnet then wasn't immediately qualified or standardised in the form of the 14-line poem that we now identify as. Now, you may recognise this, not this actor perhaps, but this figure here. This is Malvolio from Shakespeare's comedy Twelfth Night. There are a number of points in Shakespeare's plays where sonnets are mentioned. There are also moments in Shakespeare's plays where sonnet-like poems, poems that might be sonnets, are spoken or are discovered. My favourite is in As You Like It. If anyone has read As You Like It, you may remember that Orlando, the besotted lover, who's really a figure of fun, he is a caricature of the classic sort of courtly lover who is also completely swept up in devoted admiration to this young woman, that all he can think about is how to pour out his love to her in these beautiful lyric expressions. So Orlando's out there in the forests, and he decides that what he will do is to pin poems to the trees, so that his lover, when she walks through the forest, will discover them, and that she will figure out that these poems could only have been written by him, and that they could only be gifts for her. What she in fact does is she pulls them off and she says, "Oh my God, that's really awful," and she reads them aloud and mocks them to her friend because they're so poorly written. And what Shakespeare there is lampooning or satirising was the contemporary trend, particularly among fashionable young men who were aristocrats and who were attached to the court of Elizabeth in London, the contemporary trend to write love poems in the forms of sonnets. It was something that virtually everybody was doing at the time. It was almost a kind of necessary kind of passport into erotic encounters. It was de rigueur. So young men were continually pouring out all of these sonnets, making them up for their lovers, which means, inevitably, that the great mass of sonnets that we have from the period when Shakespeare was writing are terrible. They're really awful. They're basically just teenage poems of the kind that I suspect we're all familiar with. I certainly wrote plenty. So they're bad poems, most of these sonnets. Now, it's only in the comedies by Shakespeare that Shakespeare draws attention to this fad, this trend for sonnet writing. And the figures who write sonnets, or who are interested in sonnets in Shakespeare's plays, are typically caricatures. They are caricatures or stereotypes, representations of well-known and well-hated, obnoxious figures that everybody would recognise. And here is one such, in the comedy Twelfth Night, Act 3, Scene 4, line 25. As you may know, if you've read this play, he is an officious steward. In other words, he's like the kind of house manager of the house of a lady, an aristocratic lady, and he's in love with his mistress, with this woman who he serves in the role of a kind of manager, a steward of her affairs. He's a very puritanical, stuck-up, self-admiring figure, and he's the butt of plenty of jokes in Twelfth Night. So he's someone that everybody in the play despises. He's always trying to kill all of their joy. He's always complaining that they stay up too late drinking. He's trying to shut them all up all the time. So they play a trick on him, and they leave a fake letter from his mistress in which she says, really it's these some relatives of hers who are tricking him, but she, so far as he knows, says, if you really love me, then show up in my garden wearing yellow stockings, tightly cross-gartered like this, and then I will know that it's a sign that you do love me. And so he goes off into this crazy narcissistic spiral of fantasy, thinking, all of the time that I've been pining, desiring my mistress, she was in love with me too, how fantastic. So of course he runs away, gets the yellow stockings, cross-garters himself, and as he's standing there, he soliloquizes, thinking about this great future which is now coming to him, because he's going to marry the aristocratic lady of the household. And he begins to complain comically about the constriction of the blood in his legs, because they're so tightly gartered. And he says, this does make some obstruction in the blood, this cross-gartering, but what of that? If it please the eye of one, it is with me, as the very true sonnet is, please one and please all. And please the eye of one means please the eye of my mistress, of course. And this poem here, the bottom, which is not what we would now call a sonnet, does not appear in Twelfth Night, so I have just found it and put it here for you. But this is the poem that Malvolio means. It's a kind of bawdy barroom drinking song. Please one, please all, be they great, be they small. It's things that people would drink in a bar. So here, he kind of suddenly contradicts his character by erupting, not by actually erupting in song, but by thinking of this song, which erupts in bars, but which he calls a very true sonnet. So we know about Malvolio then that he is a reader of sonnets, he is a memorizer of sonnets. He's the kind of man that likes sonnets. Similarly here, another caricature, in this case a kind of racist stereotype at the time, of a Spanish aristocrat. The English and the Spanish have been at war for a long time, so it pleased English audiences to see caricatures or stereotypes of Spaniards on stage. Spaniards were there to be ridiculed, there to be mocked. And in Love's Labour's Lost, another of the comedies of Shakespeare, in which all of the buffoons, all of the clown-like comical characters are scholars. They are men who know a lot about history, a lot about literature, and they clown around, falling in love in like horribly erudite ways, which are really preposterous. So here, Armado, this Spanish scholar, again, I won't read the whole of this thing, but you can have a look at it, but there at the end of this passage, he's again soliloquizing about how he is in love with this beautiful woman, and he loves the very ground that her feet walk on, but he keeps correcting himself because that's not worthy his dignity to love that, etc. Then at the end here he says, assist me, some extemporal god of rhyme, for I am sure I shall turn sonnet. Devise wit, write pen, for I am for whole volumes in folio. In other words, help me out, god of extemporal, in other words, god of improvised or sudden inspiration, the god of rhyme, because I need to write sonnets, I need to turn into a sonnet, I need to be a sonnet for her, because then she will fall in love with me. So again, he is fantasizing about the potential power of the sonnet as a lure, as a kind of bait, as an erotic attraction to a woman. And again, Shakespeare, of course, is ironizing and he is ridiculing the idea of a man who writes sonnets in order to trap or attract a woman, in this case. Now, we might think then that it's odd that someone who so often in his comedies, at least, and only in his comedies, draws attention to the absurdity of the trend in sonnet writing, should nonetheless go on and write lots of sonnets himself. But Shakespeare was a sublimely ironic and ingenious writer. And when Shakespeare set about writing his own sonnets, we don't need the whole story today, but you can go away and read it yourself about how some of them were commissioned, some of them probably were for a man, some of them probably were for a woman. We don't know the identities of the people that they were addressed to. But when he set about writing these things, he set about it in the full knowledge that they had existed for a long time, for hundreds of years, that the massive bulk of them were dreadful and really not worth reading at all, and that they were a trendy, fashionable device used particularly by stupid aristocratic young men. Shakespeare was not an aristocrat, incidentally. And so he now was going to practice and to inhabit a form which, for all sorts of reasons, seemed to him kind of implicitly to have been worn out already to be a slightly stupid venture to attempt. Nonetheless, he did it, and he wrote what I think are probably not too controversial to say the greatest sonnets in the English language, maybe some of the greatest poems in the English language. And here is one. This is number 62. Sin of self-love possesseth all mine eye, and all my soul, and all my every part. And for this sin there is no remedy. It is so grounded inward in my heart. Methinks no face so gracious is as mine, no shape so true, no truth of such account, and for myself mine own worth do define, as I all other in all worths surmount. But when my glass shows me myself indeed, beated and chopped with tanned antiquity, mine own self-love quite contrary I read. Self so self-loving were iniquity. 'Tis thee, myself, that for myself I praise, painting my age with beauty of thy days. Okay, I'm just going to a little historical detail about the use of some of these phrases which Shakespeare here is playing with. So last couple of weeks ago when I took back John Clare's poem, I said it was really important if we attempt a philological reading, think about what exactly the language that the poet uses sounded like at the time that they actually used it. What were its resonances? What were its echoes? So to begin then with the first line here, sin of self-love, with the first phrase. What did self-love mean around about this time? So here, a little earlier than this time, this is from a text, a translation of the philosopher Erasmus. So, many shall hate thee if thou love thyself. Undoubtedly, nothing is more hurtful to man. That little line there indicates it's a typographical device which indicates an N. To a man than self-love is. Neither is it possible but that he must needs displease many that pleaseth himself and standeth best in his own conceit. So this then is a very familiar sounding account of narcissism. The man who loves himself is going to annoy everybody else by constantly preening himself. Here is a slightly more ominous description of self-love. So, like as if one cast into a hot burning furnace wooden sticks that be sere and dry and ready to burn, there will arise and burn out a most pure and clear flame of fire. But if he shall cast into the same furnace green sticks, wet and stinking rushes, or some other such matter, they will burn indeed, but the chimney and whole house will be filled with smoke, and will be even black by reason of the thick darkness which proceedeth of the foul and stinking smoke. So the heart of man is a furnace continually burning. If thou wilt nourish it with cogitations and heavenly meditations of the love of God, there will appear and shine out of it a pure flame and bright light of true and unfeigned love to God and man. But if thou wilt cherish and maintain it with thoughts and devices of self-love, then it will be full of vile smoke and stink and darkness. It's a much more dramatic way of putting it. So here, Cawdrey in this text, 1609, exact contemporary with Shakespeare, showing how obnoxious, how repulsive self-love was, at least probably from a Christian point of view, but also just from a general social point of view. That it's like loading your fire with wet things, or perhaps like a bin fire, you might call it now. What then about possesseth all mine eye? So, here are a couple of uses of possesseth. What does he mean by possesseth all mine eye? So first of all, from Calvin's sermons, translated here by the poet Arthur Golding, who also famously translated Ovid's Metamorphoses in this period. So Calvin was a great theological reformer, a great theologian. So we see then that one sort is letted, yea, or rather utterly turned back, letted here means stopped or prevented, utterly turned back from coming to Jesus Christ, because they presume upon their own wisdom and are possessed with an imagination that Satan hath put into their head, so that to their own seeming they be wise enough without Jesus Christ, and therefore they hold scorn of him. The other sort, which are infinite in number, notwithstanding that they acknowledge themselves to be wretched sinners, do nevertheless not seek the remedy. And why? For this present world possesseth them, and they be so wrapped in it as they cannot lift up their eyes, nor their minds, to seek the remedy that is ready for them in Jesus Christ. So, for your eyes to be possessed, here, says Calvin in the translation by Golding, is to be so wrapped up, to be so caught up in things of the world, that you have lost the power, you have lost the freedom to look where you ought to be looking. You can no longer see upward to heaven. You can no longer set your eyes on what they should be looking at. because your eyes have become possessed. Now, this doesn't necessarily imply the kind of thing that we hear about in horror films. He's not talking about the possession by demons or by Satan here. It's simply a kind of controlling, His eyes are controlled so much by worldly vanity that they can't lift themselves up to heaven. The phrase needn't necessarily, however, be it needn't be a condemnation in every use. As we see here from the second thing, Philip Sidney, the Countess of Pembroke's Arcadia, says, and this is just from the middle of a story he's telling, "We were brought to receive the favour of acquaintance with this queen, and Romana, whom the Princess Camilla did in so lively colours describe that last day, as still methinks the figure thereof possesseth mine eyes." The very phrase that Shakespeare has used again, possesseth mine eyes. So this was an idiomatic phrase, meaning if I see someone incredibly beautiful, I can't stop seeing that person's image before my eyes or in my mind. That person has possessed mine eyes. This is what that phrase meant at the time. Now, it is so grounded inward in my heart. What might Shakespeare have meant by this? Grounded inward. In today's language, today's kind of idioms, this sounds almost like coffee grinding. Something's been ground in, as we might say, you grind mud into the carpet. But that's not the sense that Shakespeare, I think, has in mind here. So here, from A Sinner's Guide, one of these Christian manuals to good behaviour, Francis Meres says, "Where there is wisdom, there is courage of mind, there is constancy and fortitude. A wise man, therefore, is one and the self-same in mind. He is not lessened," and that spelling is lessened as in reduced, "nor increased through the change of things, neither as unstayed," as in uprooted, "doth he float here and there, to be carried about with every wind of doctrine, but he remaineth perfect in Christ, grounded in charity, rooted in faith." So grounded here, within the idiom of Shakespeare's time, means, with your feet on the ground, like morally grounded. It means that you're kind of solid. You're not going to fly away. You're not going to float off. So grounded inward in my heart. This is a paradoxical, or at least ironic, use of this word here, however, by Shakespeare, because it's self-love, apparently. It's sin which has been grounded inward. He is apparently describing the sin of admiring that which is outward, that which is mere appearance, my own beauty, and yet the sin of admiration for the merely superficial is grounded deeply within his heart in the way that a Christian would say faith ought to be grounded in your heart. Now, when we come to the sestet at the end of this poem, which I'm going to spend some time looking at now in some detail, the poem gets, I think, quite complicated. Before this point, we've had what might have been almost a kind of ventriloquistic satire. By ventriloquistic, I mean, if Shakespeare had tried to write a poem in the voice of one of these sort of silly, foppish, aristocratic young men at the court who is trying to show off his sexual prowess to a woman by writing sonnets, then he might well have written a poem a bit like that. No one is as beautiful as me, no one is as gorgeous as I am, etc. So that would be an unreconstructed kind of narcissistic voice, which Shakespeare had simply ventriloquized and mocked in the first part of the poem. However, it's not. It's his own voice. He truly is confessing that he thinks he is the most beautiful. How then is he supposed to rationally deal with and interpret his own sin of loving himself? Well, it's in the last bit, the sestet, that he really does all of this work, and he does it, I think, with extraordinarily fine and impressive irony. He says, "But when my glass shows me myself indeed, beated and chopped with tanned antiquity, mine own self-love quite contrary I read. So self-loving were iniquity. 'Tis thee, myself, that for myself I praise, painting my age with beauty of thy days." So the first thing we need to understand about this poem is that Shakespeare is an old poet, and the person he's writing to, and we don't know anything about them, for reasons that I'll discuss in just a moment, the person that he's writing to is young. It's an old poet writing to a young lover, a young, beautiful person. So thy days versus my age suggests that this person could be living for a number of days that could be counted. Maybe they're just a teenager. In any case, it's someone who is very young. When my glass shows me myself indeed, that just means when I look in the mirror, my glass is my mirror, beaten and chopped with tanned antiquity. Here simply means that my face has been beaten up, chopped about. Tanned was a word which at the time signified old age, as in the way that a tanner would tan leather. So his face is looking all broken up and antique. And then suddenly, at this moment, the Volta, where he sees himself in the mirror, he thinks, oh my God, no, I can't love that. Right? So there's a moment of actual physical change in his environment where suddenly he stares himself literally in the face and thinks, what am I thinking? That really would be a sin if I were to love that, looking at himself. Now, in some versions of the text, it's important to know that this word myself was put into brackets. I think simply in order to help us to understand the poem. So one of the compositors or typesetters of Shakespeare's time decided that the poem was probably a bit too complicated or convoluted at the end. This myself, I love thee, etc. Myself. Who is this myself? Well, some friendly typesetter has decided that we'll understand it better in brackets, and indeed probably we do. So I'll preserve that for now. And let's think for a second about iniquity. What then is iniquity? Well, you may know this word. Iniquity is the noun, the abstract noun. Iniquitous is the adjective. If I am iniquitous, then I am sinful. This is a very theologically loaded word. Iniquity is sin. It's not just bad behaviour, it's sin. So, from the Gospel of Matthew, this is in the King James Version, which was the one contemporary with Shakespeare. Says Matthew 23:27, woe unto you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for ye are like unto whited sepulchres, which indeed appear beautiful outward, but are within full of dead men's bones and of all uncleanness. Even so, ye also outwardly appear righteous unto men, but within ye are full of hypocrisy and iniquity. Now this is a very famous passage in the Gospel of Matthew that Shakespeare unquestionably did know, and everybody else at the time certainly knew well too. Now it's interesting here that iniquity as a state of sinfulness or corruption in the soul is identified with innerness here, with the inward, that you can look good on the outside, and this is what the whited sepulchre means. A sepulchre is like a tomb. In other words, you are like tombs that have been painted a bright colour so that everyone will admire them, but inside you are rotting corpses and bones. That's a very powerful condemnatory moment in the Gospel of Matthew. Iniquity is on the inside, very often, of people who are beautiful on the outside. Now Shakespeare's done something clever and kind of twisted this around. I'm not sure he's fully reversed it, but he's twisted it about. My love of myself on the outside, because I am so beautiful, would be iniquity because I'm not actually that beautiful. But then, as we'll see, he gets out of this in quite a clever way in just a moment. I'm going to look in particular at the last 3 lines here and what to make of them, because this is where the poem, I think, does most of its work. This is where the poem is really thinking and is really ingenious and really might trip us up. So, what does this mean? So self-loving were iniquity. 'Tis thee, myself, that for myself I praise, painting my age with beauty of thy days. Now Shakespeare's contempt for the bad love sonnet, which he expresses through comical figures and caricatures in his plays, is partly contempt for ineptitude, technical ineptitude, in other words, poets who just don't know how to write good poems, but it's also contempt for a kind of unprocessed, witless, unconscious narcissism. In other words, poets write these poems professing to adore some beautiful, usually woman, and what they don't reflect on or think about is how vain they seem in showing off these clever devices in poems. In other words, making a display of their own wit, of their own skill, their own ingenuity, in their efforts to praise another person. So they end up seeming narcissistic, they end up seeming vain and self-obsessed, but without seeming to understand that that is how they seem. So there are these witless poets all walking around in clouds of narcissism, but unable actually, thoughtfully to process the consequences of their own narcissistic desires. Here, compressed into the last 3 lines of this poem, is Shakespeare's attempt both to acknowledge that narcissism is indeed probably an inescapable part or condition of loving another person. We can't simply switch it off, because, for one thing, we need to love ourselves at least a bit if we are to be able to love anyone else, but also that we invent excuses once we detect our own narcissistic instincts And once we realise that we love someone else because it makes us feel good about ourselves, we feel more beautiful, we feel clever, or whatever it might be, then Shakespeare is also showing us how the conscious mind processes that experience of self-detection. When you catch yourself out, you think, oh no, the reason I really like the fact that I love you is because it proves that I'm also just as clever or just as smart as you or just as beautiful as you are. But what do we then do? What are our internal strategies of irony to cope with the knowledge that we are so conceited and narcissistic? How do we cope with it? Well, this is what he does. The meaning of these last 3 lines is difficult to get clear, I think, first of all. This is the first fact about it. They are convoluted and knotty. What they express is not merely the complexity of desire for a younger, more attractive lover, but they express also the difficulty that the old lover experiences when he tries to be virtuous and tries to tell himself off for his own vanity by keeping in his mind a clear distinction between himself and the other person. So he's trying to separate himself, to extinguish his narcissism by saying, I'm me and you're you. You're beautiful, I'm old. The way that he does this is by referring to his own age and the other younger lover's beauty. The final line then seems conclusive or clear. I, he says, and he's confessing here, I use your beauty in the way that a painter uses paint to make a beautiful portrait. The beauty of the portrait then, or the seeming beauty of the portrait, is only owing to the beautiful paint itself. In other words, to you, not to the face that is depicted in the painting. In effect, the painting, me, is not beautiful. Only the paint is beautiful. Seems to be the implication here. Which is an odd thought, because why would anyone look at a painting which is not beautiful simply in order to admire beautiful paint? Or, and there's a wordplay here, the analogy could be to cosmetics. I'm painting my face, literally, in the way that I paint my face with cosmetics, with makeup. But in that case, the logic is still the same. I use your beauty as I would use makeup to paint my face and make myself look beautiful. But the seeming beauty of my made-up face is really owing to the beautiful makeup itself. It's because the makeup is beautiful, not my face, that has been painted with it. So both analogies then amount to the same acknowledgement, namely, any beauty that I might seem to possess in my own mind when I am caught up in the act of self-love, or the sin of self-love, thinking about how gracious my face is and how true my worth is in reality, he says at the end, really your beauty. And he addresses the other younger lover at this point directly. It's you, not me, who is beautiful. Insofar as what I am thinking of really is beautiful, I can only be thinking of you. Is the meaning of the end of this poem. But this is quite different from actually thinking of you directly. The poem does not give a single description of the young lover's face or shape, only of Shakespeare's old poet's own shape or face. The young lover is not so much as glimpsed. We have no idea what the young lover looks like, or even what gender the young lover is. All we know is that the young lover is beautiful and not old. For the purposes of this poem, which is overtly at least a criticism of vanity and self-love, the young lover exists only as the provider of beauty that the poet uses to paint his own face. So, rather than a humble self-criticism of the self-loving poet, this might seem like the very opposite, or even worse, yet another expression by the old poet of his own self-love, and this time without any self-criticism. It is as if the old poet ends his poem by saying that the only good or justifiable love he can feel, and really does feel, the only love that is not sin or iniquity, is the love he feels for you, the younger lover, who is beautiful. But, as if he says this, only in order to justify himself. Only, in other words, so that his praise can be good after all, since really it was never praise for himself all along. It was never self-love. It was always praise for you. It was always praise for the younger lover, or true love. Because when he praised himself, what he was really doing was praising the younger lover. His condemnation then of his own false love, or self-love, is then suddenly only a hypothetical condemnation of the self-love he would feel for himself if he were not in reality actually praising someone else rather than himself. Hence, this phrase, were iniquity. Now, it's not italicized in the original, but I put it there simply to illustrate this point. Okay? If Shakespeare had written so self-loving is iniquity, then the judgment would be, and I hate to use this word after the way it's been used in the past couple of weeks, unequivocal. He would be condemning his own vanity. If that's what he'd written, then there's no question, hands up, I have been doing this, I've been self-loving, and it is sin. Right? He'd be condemning his own vanity and his own love for himself. But what we have instead is so self-loving were iniquity. And this means something quite different. It means, here's just a paraphrase of that, it means, if I were the kind of person who loved himself in the way that I have just said I do love myself, then I would be guilty of the sin of self-love. But, as it turns out, it was never me that I was thinking of or looking at when I was caught up in my fit of self-admiration. No, on the contrary, it was you, my younger lover. And because it was you and not me that I was admiring, I am not, in fact, the kind of person who is guilty of the sin of self-love. In fact, I may be even more profoundly innocent than that. I may not even be capable of the sin of self-love, since every time I try to love myself, every time I try and look in the mirror and love myself, all I'm ever really capable of doing is loving you. So in other words, I am virtually immaculate. I cannot sin. The least twitch of narcissistic desire in me flows directly in you, toward you. Your beauty is then not merely the paint I use to paint my face in order to make it look beautiful, it's also how I get myself off the hook of iniquity and absolve myself from the sin of self-love. If I ever did actually love myself, I was really only ever loving you. The young lover might not be very pleased to hear this explanation. After all, it's not very flattering to be told that your own beauty is the cause of the narcissistic self-love of somebody else, who says that whenever he appears to be admiring himself, really he is admiring you. The young lover might say that it's all very well for the old poet to use his clever metaphor about painting his face, but what about the young lover's own face? What about my face, this lover might say? Or what about the young lover's beauty when it isn't being plastered all over the wrinkles of the old poet? The young lover might even protest that it would be preferable, he'd like it better, or she'd like it better, if the old poet shut up and simply accepted that he does love himself, get on with loving himself, and leave the younger lover out of it. Who wants to be the paint that somebody uses to make their own portrait, or the makeup that somebody uses to cover up their wrinkles? More seriously, perhaps, who wants to be introduced into a poem at the end as a source of beauty by the old poet, only so that the old poet can absolve himself of the sin of self-love and breathe easy in the knowledge that he's not a sinner after all? Making use of, in this way, exploiting, making use of the beauty of the other, younger person to cleverly absolve oneself like that might seem like a worse form of self-love even than downright self-admiration, since even metaphorical absolution for sin surely ought to be offered by someone else, not merely assumed on his own authority by the sinful old poet who wishes to be absolved. I can't absolve myself, my own self-sins, however selfish. The poet here has absolved himself of his own sin of self-love by deciding that, all along, it was not himself, but you, the young lover, who possessed all his eye and soul and every part. The young lover might then reasonably reply that, well, even if the old poet has really done this, and it is really all about me, still, it ought to be the young lover, it ought to be me, not the old poet, who gets to decide whether the poet should be absolved or not. The young lover might think that this is their prerogative, their decision to make, since, after all, it is their beauty that has provided the miraculous get-out clause. Shakespeare has anticipated all of this. This is one of the reasons why he's such a great poet. He's anticipated all the moral and sexual agony in this line, the second to last. "'Tis thee, myself, that for myself I praise." The most obvious way to paraphrase this line, and this is how it is paraphrased in all the editions that I know, is like this. When I am praising myself, I am really praising you instead of me. You are so precious to me that you mean as much to me as my whole life, and that is why I call you myself. Some poets will call their lover my heart or my soul, but you are more than that to me, so you are all of me, and I'm going to call you by the name that I give to myself as a whole. So, I'll call you myself. So, 'tis thee, myself, that I praise instead of myself, is the meaning, apparently. But again, we might wonder whether the young lover would be pleased to be called by this particular pet name. Imagine the love letter that begins, "Dear myself." But whatever the young lover feels is in any case essentially irrelevant here in this poem, since there is unfortunately no space left for the young lover's reply. Since, after all, a standardised sonnet has only 14 lines, and sadly they've all been used up, so you'll have to come back later. In any case, even if the young lover thinks it is very romantic or sexy to be called myself by the old poet, the poem is too artful and ironic to allow this pet name simply to express affection and not imply anything else. The complex but unmissable implication is that even when the old poet is addressing or talking to or thinking of the young lover, whom he calls myself, he is always really addressing or talking to or thinking of that other myself, namely himself. What then looks like a model for self-criticism or an instruction manual on how to avoid the sin of self-love in 2 easy stages, octave and sestet, ends up instead insinuating a more subtle or inescapable form of the very same sin, but now with the convenient appendage of another person, who is brought in at the last moment to redeem the whole history of sinful adoration by being revealed to be the true lover, the true object of what is, after all, in the end, a true love, miraculously enough, because it's not love for me, myself, it's love for you, myself. That's it.